Have you ever wondered what goes on underground in big cities? Go 20 or 30 meters up, and there's life boiling, day replaces night, and hundreds, maybe even thousands of people going about their business. But down there, it's always night, populated only by machines and rats. Or is it? That's how I would have started writing the book if that idea hadn't left me long ago, when I took the job temporarily. 10 years later there is no hope of changing it, and every time I think I got used to it, is every time I realize that it is impossible to get used to it. I work in the Research Institute, which is located just outside the Moscow Ring Road. Our institution is restricted. This means that it is secret. From the street, or rather from the wasteland where it is located, the Research Institute looks like a small 5-story building, strongly reminiscent of a school. The building is still Soviet, so I would not be surprised if it was really a project of a typical school to divert attention and save manpower. However, the top 5 floors are the tip of the iceberg. In fact, there are 2 lower floors that are much larger than the building above, and that's where all the equipment and labs are. And only 3 floors work upstairs, and the top 2 are almost never used, so they are filled with scrapped and sometimes not scrapped junk. I do not think that after all I am about to tell you, it would be reasonable to mention anything about the activities of the Research Institute itself, because by writing down and putting it all on the net I am already setting myself up, so no details about the laboratories below will be given. However, I work even lower down. The fact is that below the 2 underground floors there is a basement with utilities that stretch far into Moscow and even connect to the subway. My job is to keep an eye on them. When I responded to the job offer, the first thing that surprised me was the requirements. They were looking for a person who had degrees and experience as an electrician, plumber and watchman. Although they were paying a very solid sum and were even willing to take a person with no experience at all. Of course, I agreed. I saw a life full of pretty much free money for the next couple of years at least. Though, the first time I went down into the basement, I realized where the catch was. These tunnels were laid in Soviet times, they did not have any light sources, and on the day of the shift, which happened once a month, it was necessary to venture to the point of connection with the subway and go back. I had to walk for almost an entire day, and I was not allowed to have a partner. It was also strictly forbidden to print out any subway exits or other urban communication locations, which effectively meant that I had to get in and back out at the same place. My equipment was the simplest I had ever been assigned: a flashlight-mounted helmet, 1 handheld flashlight, a small backpack for tools, a walkie-talkie, and a taser. The latter was meant in case I was in danger in the tunnel, and the instructions told me to turn off the flashlight on my helmet immediately if I detected any unauthorized people in the tunnels, report the intruders over the walkie-talkie and go back. In other words, if any diggers, homeless people, punk kids, etc. got into the tunnel somehow. It wasn't my job to smoke them out, which was already a relief. My instructions told me to examine the communications in the form of huge wires, it is unclear what for, and to report any damages on the radio, then proceed to repair or call the brigade. However, I later found out that calling a brigade was strongly disapproved by my superiors. It was the same with the pipes, but in this case, calling the crew was a necessity. There were also some strange things in the instructions which immediately caught my attention. Though, any questions regarding them were threatened with a reprimand, for the Research Institute itself, as well as everything in it, is, let me remind you, a secret facility. One of the strange instructions told me to never close the gate to the blind passages which laid closer to the subway. Another said that if there was, and I quote, strong, blocking signal interference in radio communication devices, I had to stop going around and go back, and if it was more than halfway through, stay put and wait for help. There were many such things, but these 2 instructions struck me as odd from the start. Next I will describe a few of my hikes that led me to repeatedly try to change jobs while doubting my mental health. I remember the first time particularly well. I was briefly introduced to the place of work. The stairs went down to a small, very shabby and dusty room. There was a lonely chair in the room, and the elevator shaft to the left was bricked up. This was strange, for there was no elevator. At the right end of the room was a small, narrow corridor that led out to a huge canal with pipes running through it. The pipes were huge, and they were laid below the entrance to the canal, and on top of the pipes was a metal walkway, a transition bridge, like the ones under the roof in shopping malls. The pipes followed the canal for another 50 meters, after which they reached a bunker with a heavy iron door, above which a construction lamp was always lit. It was the only light in the canal. To the left of the bunker was another heavy iron door, behind which was my workplace. It looked like a normal guard's office, monitors displaying data from the tunnel's pressure and voltage sensors, as well as a couple of cameras in key locations, a bed, a couple of medium-sized iron boxes, and one large one. Except for the huge iron door, the musty smell, and the lack of windows, it was a cozy enough place. Directly opposite the den, or on the right side of the bunker, was the entrance to the tunnels. There was no door on it, and into it went the very metal walkway that separated from the main one. Also, just opposite the entrance to this channel, was a huge-sized door, all into the same tunnels, but it didn't open. It was big enough to pull a tank through, and I never understood why it needed such a huge door. I also met the operator who sat at the checkpoint and who was on call with my walkie-talkie. He wasn't very old, but he was a graying man with an amusing gray mustache. We exchanged a few words, and as we talked he looked at me with a dejected expression. This made me feel uneasy. I spent the next 2 days in the closet, watching the readings through my fingers, but on the third day one of the screens began to go crazy. And so began my first hike. The screen showed that there was an unusually high load on one of the lines, and I immediately turned on the radio. Checkpoint, do you read me? Do you copy?
I heard good, over.
I've got a 120 amp load on line 4X, over.
I've got a short circuit load on line 4X of 350 amps, over.
I don't understand you, is everything alright, over?
Listen, Seryosha.
He suddenly broke the formal style of communication. Vadim Ilyich, the checkpoint attendant, with whom we had communicated with earlier.
You should go there now and check what happened. But my advice to you is to wait until the load is gone, and then go and check in.
Copy that, checkpoint. I ended the conversation. The pressure was gone after an hour, and I was ready to walk deep into the tunnel for the first time. I must say that I was in high spirits, for two reasons. I was getting very bored of sitting idle for the third day, and I was finally ready to get to my main job. I put my backpack on my back and hoisted my helmet on, flicking the light switch. As I left the den and closed the door behind me, I reported to the checkpoint. The officer on duty confirmed my departure, and I approached the tunnel. As I reached the entrance of the tunnel, the flashlight shone into the darkness, but only the walls were visible. There was this dense blackness ahead. For the first time, I was standing there alone, without people, outside the den. Something buzzed somewhere far away, but the silence still squeaked in my ears. It was quiet enough that I could hear myself breathing, and the blackness of the tunnel didn't seem so interesting anymore. Something in me squealed loudly for a second and began to fill my brain with thoughts that it would be a good idea to fuck off now and give up work. At the same time, the thought of turning my back on the tunnel was less attractive than to walk into it. In the end, I got over myself and decided to keep going. After a couple of 100 meters, the iron bridge ended, and I was already walking on dirt, breathing in the air that reeked terribly of dampness and dust. I had to cover my face with my sleeve to avoid coughing every couple of meters, but after a couple of minutes my body got used to the humidity and stopped reacting so strongly. In short, I reached the point of failure, and it was pretty bad. It was chewed up, and there were teeth marks, like human teeth, but a lot more. Only the insulation was chewed to shit though, the wires themselves were untouched. I reported everything on the radio, asked them to turn off power for the line, to which I got the reply that I had to wait. I took off my backpack, sat on it and lit up the flashlight. It took them about 10 minutes to cut the power off, after which I wrapped the wire with a couple of layers of duct tape and insulation. While I was doing that, I noticed a lump of strange goo on the wall, more like some kind of strange mushroom, now that I think of it. When I finished wrapping the wiring, I touched it with my foot, and suddenly about 300 meters away I heard a loud thud, as if an old sack had fallen to the ground. Something told me that I had to run away fast, and so I did, leaving the backpack with all the stuff there. I was exhausted by the end of it, barely made it to the exit, where I realized that the backpack was lost. I couldn't do anything else but to report it to the checkpoint. The next day my boss was not happy with me to say the least. I was reprimanded and threatened with dismissal. Though, after some explanations, they were quick to forgive and forget. What made everything worse was when I remembered what Ilyich had told me about the load. I started to worry, thinking of what would I have seen if I went straight in there without the weight. The next 3 hikes were simple, nothing much happened in them. I had even begun to forget the first hike, and the 3 times I had already received my paycheck helped a lot. And so again, as in most working hours, I was sitting in the closet, looking at the monitors and passing the time by playing the ancient shooting games. Internet access was forbidden from the Scientific Research Institute building, and cell phones were also forbidden. So as not to be bored, I downloaded some shooters which would run on the local old computer. I should also mention that, according to the instructions, I should always keep the door closed to the watchroom. It doesn't matter whether I'm inside or outside. And Ilyich has repeatedly hinted that to follow the instructions is very much worth it. And so I sit there, finish the last enemy monsters, and suddenly notice that something does not quite come together. I paused the game, and indeed, one of the sounds remained. I started listening. The sound came as if from behind a wall, such a soft tapping. The source in the wall was constantly moving, as if crawling inside. I don't know what the hell possessed me at the time, but I went and tapped the wall back, and that's when the shit kicked in. The banging suddenly started to increase, and at the same time, it moved along the wall towards the door, one bang at a time. The last few blows were so hard that crumbs fell from the ceiling and the light bulbs flickered. I was frightened, so I grabbed my taser off the table and cowered in the corner, but after the last blow, everything stopped abruptly. I was still sitting there with the taser in my arms and my heart beating wildly, slowly coming to my senses, but just as I decided to get up, I heard footsteps. Or rather, not so much heard as felt the floor vibrate faintly, as if something heavy was moving through the pipes, and, judging by the sound, it stopped about near the door. I should have reported it to the checkpoint, but I was afraid to move, let alone speak. Suddenly, there was scratching at the door. It was scratching somewhere very low, but the sound was as if a whole bunch of claws were scratching at the same time. Then the sound stopped for a second, and something slammed into the door very hard. The impact was so powerful that one of the lights in the den went out and a whole piece of plaster fell off the ceiling. I grabbed my walkie-talkie and started to say really incoherent shit, begging to know what was going on. In the meantime, the door banged a couple more times, and then there was silence. After about 10 minutes, the door was opened on the other side, and a very fucked up police unit and a stern, scowling Ilyich, who was the only one who remained calm, came in. When I examined the door at the bottom, there was a whole pile of dead rats, which, judging by their bloody paws and a couple of claws stuck in the stone next to the door, were very anxious to get to the other side, and there was also a small dent in the door, but since it was solid iron and about as thick as a safe door, what had left the dent must have been enormous. Nothing else was found, and I decided after this incident to look for a new job in parallel with this one. I really didn't want to go back into the tunnels after such an incident. Ilyich was as silent as a dead man, and no matter how much I tried to get something out of him, he said nothing, except that there was nothing on the cameras, and therefore, most likely, there was a collapse. What the hell kind of collapse in a man-made canal, hits a door vertically, and leaves no debris? I have no idea, but that's what all the paperwork said. After that I decided to study the footage from all the cameras, but, as luck had it, there was exactly nothing on the cameras. Needless to say, I still hadn't found a better job. The fourth hike was on schedule, and I went into the tunnel, this time holding tightly onto my taser. On my second hike I bought a construction respirator to make it easier to breathe in all that dust. And so I walked calmly forward, not stopping every 100 meters to catch my breath and cough. I was very close to the subway connection when one of the blind passages caught my eye. A slight breeze was blowing from it, but it was chilling me to the bone. This was clearly not normal, and I reported it to the checkpoint. I wish I hadn't done that, because they immediately told me to go and check for open exits. I had to go, so I did. The farther I went, the stronger the wind was, and the colder it got. When my hands began shaking from the cold, I began to hear something like whispers in the howling wind, and the further I walked, the less I heard the wind, and the louder the whispers became. There were a lot of voices, and they were all whispering something very intrusive, but I was so cold that I didn't think much about it. Near the end, the passage turned a corner, and I noticed that near that corner the whole passage was painted with strange lines. I could have lied that they were strange runes or symbols, but what I saw was clearly a bunch of lines, drawn all over with what I could only think was chalk, dirt, something dark brown, or just scratched on the walls and the insulation of the wires. As I neared the curve, my helmet light went out abruptly, and at the same time I felt eyes on me. By this moment I was already freezing to death, so I reached with clumsy fingers for the flashlight on my belt, and as I switched it on, I pointed it straight ahead of me. In the light of the flashlight, I saw something. I don't know exactly how to describe it. Tiny, black holes instead of eyes that looked more like nostrils, a round head without a mouth, without any features, just folds of skin. It stared at me, and I felt a great weakness in my whole body, growing colder and colder. I just wanted to lie down and go to sleep. My brain had already drawn a picture of me lying down on the floor of the tunnel, with my legs tucked up and trying to keep warm, falling asleep, and this creature coming up to me asleep and starting to devour me. The thought reeked of both terror and an almost home-like comfort. Perhaps it would have ended that way, but I was saved by the fact that the radio suddenly clicked, and Ilyach's voice was heard.
Post, where have you gone? Have you found the source of the wind? Over.
The flashlight blinked, and for a moment the creature was right in front of my face, and then it was gone. Both lanterns lit up as if nothing had happened, and the wind was suddenly gone. I turned off the handheld flashlight, jammed it behind my belt, and, still staring into the void, pulled out my walkie-talkie. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. Checkpoint, the wind has stopped. I couldn't find the source. Over. After that, I leaned against the tunnel wall and had a smoke to warm myself up. I was shaking, and the scene of me falling asleep was playing over and over in my head. After finishing my cigarette, I decided to walk to the corner to make sure the danger was over and I could turn back in peace. The lantern revealed a cul-de-sac, already completely matted with dashes, and in the middle was a circle drawn in chalk, in which lay in the fetal position a dried human corpse that did not even smell of dead meat. I shuddered again. But now I also felt very nauseous. That's what could have happened to me if it wasn't for the walkie-talkie. I almost died. This time it wasn't a knock on the door, or strange noises, no. It was real life-threatening. I couldn't stop myself. I was nauseated and shaking. Completely exhausted, I stepped away from the corner so I wouldn't have to see the body, and pulled out the radio again. Checkpoint, there's a body. Call the police. Over.
We will. Saryosha, you better get back here quick. Over.
For the second time they called my name. I went back as if in a dream. That creature appeared everywhere in the shadows, and I stubbornly tried not to look back. I reached the den, closed the door sharply, and collapsed on my bed. I dreamed that I was walking through a tunnel and that I could hear a chuckling behind me, but I was too afraid to turn around. Or did I really hear the chuckling as I walked backwards? That's the part I don't remember very well. In any case, it was Ilyach who woke me up. There were no police, but there were military officers, constantly throwing oblique glances at me. There were unusually many of them. Ilyach sat next to me on the bed, and he smelled strongly of booze.
It was Yura, after all. He worked here before you. When I heard about the corpse from you, I knew right away it was Yura.
Ilyach mumbled, staring at the floor. I wanted to swear at him. And him, as well as our superiors. Vadim Ilyach, I quit.
No, Sergey, you're not.
Ilyach looked at me with sad eyes.
If you don't get fired from here, you won't find another job now. I don't care what you do.
I did not even doubt his words. I just got up and went home to sleep. The next day I was summoned to my superiors and given a hefty bonus and a week off to recover from the shock. Needless to say, I spent the whole week drinking that bonus away at the club. But I returned to work unrested. Now almost every night I had a dream about falling asleep in that tunnel. I had a feeling that morning, that it was going to be a bad day. I didn't feel like going to work, even though the day of the venture had not yet arrived. My fears were confirmed when I arrived. The monitor showed a severe pressure drop in the pipes at the end of the tunnel near the subway. I contacted the checkpoint and was told to go there. As usual, I packed up and plunged into the darkness of the tunnels. About halfway to the end of the tunnel I started hearing rustles somewhere above me, and it made me speed up my step, but the rustles kept up. It sounded like someone was using a long pole to push paper through the pipes that ran along the edges of the tunnel. A rat ran out in front of me, causing me to jump in place, and my twitching flashlight picked out a strange shadow from the darkness of the tunnel. I put my hand on the taser, and the last encounter in the blind passage replayed in my mind. I continued on my way and suddenly realized that right above me in the tunnel something was crawling. Trying not to look up, I tried to convince myself that it was just rats, and kept walking forward. Fortunately, the rustling began to fade quickly, and I calmed down a bit. When I reached the right pipe, I began to examine it, occasionally looking nervously back into the dark emptiness of the tunnel. The pipe was already helpfully covered, but very many things about it seemed strange to me. First of all, given the size of the pipe, there should have been a huge puddle where I was now standing, but there wasn't one. Instead there was only a small puddle, which appeared to have gathered only after the water had already been shut off. Second, a fairly large section of the pipe was covered with small triangular holes, the edges of which looked like the metal had been bitten off. Realizing that I obviously could not do it myself, I reported the size of the necessary pipe and asked to send a brigade. Ilyach replied that I would have to wait for the brigade on the spot. Once again cursing the job, I asked him not to delay with the brigade and gave myself a little break. I opened some canned food, got a bottle of water and decided to have a little snack. I turned on the flashlight and placed it such that it would shine into the tunnel. I waited for about 2 hours, but the crew never showed up. By this time I felt more or less safe and once again contacted the checkpoint, asking where the brigade was, but I was answered by a slightly agitated Ilyich, who said that there had been no communication with the brigade for an hour already, and that I should go back. I remembered the rustling in the tunnel, which I had seen earlier, and I felt an unpleasant feeling in my stomach. Gathering up the rest of my resting place, I walked back at a fairly brisk pace. I didn't encounter any rustling or other oddities on the way back, but that didn't make it any easier. And so, halfway back, about the same place where I had heard the rustles, I found the brigade. It was not a sight for the faint-hearted. On sections of the pipe, stuck into the ground in a random order, were strung pieces of meat, literally chewed up beyond recognition, with bits of skin and guts stretching out between them. Oddly enough, there wasn't blood everywhere, like one would expect. I stood there, staring at it all. The stench was awful, and I felt like throwing up right there, before snapping out of it and running out of there with all my might, and the best part was that a piece of lung strung on one of the pipes twitched as I ran past it. This time the fear so overwhelmed my mind that I ran without a backward glance and scarcely noticed that a tall dark figure of very disagreeable proportions had been picked out of the darkness by the lantern close to the tunnel exit. I did not have time to figure out what was going on, and I ran right through it. My face and all the exposed part of my skin felt like they were scalding, and I involuntarily screamed and ran even faster, feeling the blisters on my hands swell up. Right at the entrance to the tunnel I only had time to press a button on my radio and shout something indecipherable into it, and then I lost consciousness. I woke up in the hospital, and it turned out that I had been asleep for 12 hours, but it seemed to me that I had run out of the tunnel a second ago. Now I was in the burn unit, and the doctors said that my eyes were miraculously intact. Ilyich came and brought me a letter from his superiors. There was another order for a bonus, as well as instructions not to share with the medical staff of the hospital the circumstances of how the injuries had been sustained. Ilyich stayed with me for a while and told me that I was the first person to stay alive this long on the job, and that I was probably being looked after from above. But personally, I think they're looking out for me from someplace else.